All right. After months of working hard, here we are at part 4, the home stretch, working on the old Case 580CK. There were problems with the backhoe swing, and we were working on that. The backhoe swing was having trouble obeying commands, and it would dangerously continue to move after you wanted it to be stopped. Flopping around so easy, even this old guy could move it around with ease. So basically, the backhoe was useless, even dangerous to use. So of course, we needed to find out what was wrong and fix it. And that's where the journey started back in part 1. We first focused in on the 2 swing cylinders. See what we could see there. We found out a lot. Like this swing cylinder had fallen apart inside, a likely cause of our swing problem. But there were other problems that we found that needed fixing too, like these worn out Trunnion pivots on the swing cylinders, and many of the other cylinders on the tractor were leaking, and we wanted to repair those too. So that set me off on this journey. If you didn't watch parts 1, 2, or 3, well, you've missed a lot.
Suit yourself.
We're just going to continue on with where we left off in part 3. So altogether during this project, we rebuilt 10 of the 12 ram cylinders on this tractor. And they all had this bolt at the end of the rod holding the piston on that had to be removed. But we found that the bigger cylinders like this one had bolts so tight that we couldn't get them loose even with this 3/4 inch drive breaker bar. It was bending the breaker bar to where it would have ruined it if we had tried harder. So we had to take this one into town and have the big heavy-duty tire place break it loose with their
monster heavy-duty 1-inch drive impact wrench.
So just to get an idea what we're dealing with here, there's the 3/4 inch drive breaker bar. Here's 3/8 and half, which is usually what I need to work on cars and stuff. But this 3/4 we thought it would be enough. And it is perfect for the smaller cylinders on the tractor. But for the bigger ones, I went up to this 1-inch drive. I found it used on eBay along with the sockets. And it's what it takes to get the bigger piston rod bolts loose and tightened back on again on the bigger cylinders. We're talking 700 foot-pounds, 800 foot-pounds, 900 foot-pound torque specs. The 1-inch drive worked perfectly. So back to the project. Now we've got the bolt loose and we can continue on with rebuilding this cylinder with a new kit. This is specific to the Case 580CK, and even other kits might have different looks, different colors, but the basic layout's the same. There's these stiff backers that are just supports for the seal. There's the actual seal, and you can see it's really crumbling apart. We found this on a lot of the cylinders, even though they still function somewhat.
There's one more backer after this.
We think maybe the deterioration of the seal is from water contamination we found in a lot of the cylinders and in the hydraulic system overall.
Now, some of the cylinders on the tractor have these blondish looking urethane seals, and they seem to have held up much better.
This other half of the piston is a duplicate mirror image. Spacers. There's the seal falling apart.
Another spacer.
No, I don't have a solvent washing tank for parts or anything, so this is just diesel fuel, a brush, and I'm just outside on the ground. All the sanding, grit, and dust and dirt has to be cleaned off of these before they can be put back together again. And I'm just using water because that's what I have. Main thing is to get them dried off quickly so they don't rust from the water. Shake and blow the worst of the water off, then leave them in the sun if it's a fair day, or bring them in around the wood stove, or put them in the oven on low for 10-15 minutes.
Get them dry right away.
Now for reassembling this with a new kit, they usually come in the right order in the kit, but I wouldn't assume that they do. See that one there, it bends more than the other ones? That's because that's the actual seal. The other ones are much stiffer, and they are just backers and supporters. And this one's really different because one side of it is flat, where all the other ones have a V groove. So the flat one goes on first with its flat against the flat of the piston half. Then comes one of the stiff ones, and it's got the V on both sides of it. It's a innie and an outie V, like your belly buttons. So the innie V of this goes in the outie V of the one in front of it. So the next one, this is the actual seal. It's more rubbery. Innie V to outie V. Then this is another backer. It's stiff, and it goes on. Innie to outie. And the other side is just a duplicate mirror image of what we just did. Same exact parts. In the middle goes this spacer, and it doesn't matter which way it goes. It's identical on either side. Get that on there. Then the other piston half. And there you go.
There you go.
There you go. I wouldn't be doing any of this stuff without the book. I've got the factory book to follow, and I highly recommend that. Okay, that takes care of the piston work, but before that piston can be reassembled on the rod, this gland has to be removed from the rod so it can be rebuilt. And that means installing new wipers and seals and doing any minor repair work that needs to be done. First have to remove all the wipers and seals. This type of wiper on the Style 3 is the hardest kind to remove. See, it's got a metal backing. There's probably a less destructive way to remove this, but I haven't figured it out. The way I got it to come out was I snuck a screwdriver underneath the bottom metal piece right here, pounding it in with the hammer, and scratched up the gland seat a little bit, but that place doesn't matter if it gets scratched. Although later I did take my Dremel and clean up the worst of the scratches first, before installing the new seal. But anyway, I kept prying and pounding under there around and around until I finally got the seal to come out. But we only had one wiper like that. All the rest were this snap-in split type that's really easy to remove and install. Just got to dig up behind it with a pick or screwdriver and pull it out of there. Just be careful not to scratch the gland's metal behind this wiper.
Now here's the rod seal, and it's a bit of a thing to get in and out and not scratch up the metal around it or to mess up the new one when you're putting it in. These little tools are common in the hardware store, like in a pack, and I especially like this hooked one that can sneak around back behind the seal when it's in the gland and grab a hold of it and pry it out of its little ditch without scratching up the metal of the gland. Now here's a stripped down gland. All the seals and wipers are removed, and it's been wire wheeled out to get rid of the rust. Down in there is where the seal goes, and you can see that pitted roughness. That's from water getting in and rusting. So that rough surface, even though it's been wire wheeled clean, is going to allow hydraulic fluid to sneak around the rough area and leak out. And also up here on the wiper, it's going to let water get in if it's pitted and rough there.
Now we already touched on this in part 3, and you might recognize some of the scenes, but now let's go a little further. And up ahead here, I'll show an inexpensive way to hopefully repair it.
All right, with all that out of the way, let's get down to rebuilding this gland. Here's the new kit for the cylinder, and I invested in this little tool, a seal installation tool. Makes putting the seal in a lot easier. See the description below for source of where I got the tools and the seal kits. I already talked about this briefly in part 3, but this is how I'm going to heal up the rough, rusty surface down in there where the seal is going to go. And I think that this is going to help. It's a gasket sealer. Next, I install this Style 2 backup ring into the slot where the seal also goes. And you'll see in the sketch where this sits. We want to be sure we don't squish this ring or have it on the wrong side of the seal. Now this seal only goes in one way. See, there's a ditch there on this side, and this side it's just flat. If you look at the drawing, you can see it's called a U-cup, and that goes down in first. So I want to load it on this tool in the right direction so the flat part's facing me and the U part's down below. And this is how it's loaded up on this tool. It looks like it's going to mess it up, but it's okay. And then carefully feed it down past the backup ring and then let it loose in the slot. And it almost makes it all the way in, but you got to give it one more little tap there, and it kind of just boing, pops right in. And give it a good look and see that the backup ring is up on top and it didn't get folded under or damaged.
What a pain, that backup ring on these Style 2s.
Yeah, it looks good. I can see all the way around. The backup ring edge is still there. Okay, next I want to install one of these split snap-in rod wipers. There's 2 for each cylinder and they are identical. I just want to fold it around itself to make it smaller and then put it in there and expand it out so there's no overlap. Alright, looking good. Now let's install the other split wiper on the outside. Now this is the one that has pitted rusty metal there, and it's just going to let water go right on in. And if you remember from part 3, there's also a way water and grit is coming in at the split. So my remedy, I'm not sure how it's going to work over the long run, is to add this gasket maker, a thin amount, but put extra right where the split is. So the gasket maker will squeeze into the space and fill in the split. Now for this all to come together with that gasket maker, which is not a normal part of rebuilding these, this gland has to be put back on the rod while that gasket maker is still wet. I have grease on the rod, and the idea is just to slide it on down and leave it on there for 24 hours and let that gray gasket maker dry. See how it's filling in where the split is? And this should help keep water and grit out.
The grease on the rod will keep the gasket maker from sticking. Leave it for a day, let it cure.
Okay, for installing this Style 3 press-in wiper, it's pretty straightforward. It can be pressed in or gently pounded in, but I suggest using some of this gasket sealer around to help seal it up. And I also suggest pounding it down below grade until you see the gasket sealer oozing out from underneath here, which will help complete a watertight seal around the outside of this press-in wiper.
The last items in our cylinder rebuild kit are these O-rings and backup rings, and they are to seal the outside of this gland, keeping outside water from getting in, keeping hydraulic fluid from getting out.
So I'm just going to show a dress rehearsal here. The parts haven't been cleaned up totally yet, but you get the idea. I'm putting the flat backup ring on first, and I'm putting a second backup ring on from the other side, just to show that you can do it that way. And normally there's only one, but remember in part 3 I explained why I liked having two. Having two backup rings will move the place over where the O-ring's going to go, over here where it's shiny smooth, and get it away from these pockmarked rusty places, giving the O-ring a better chance to seal. The rebuild kit only comes with one backup ring, and so I'm saving the old one so that I can put two together. And now when I bring the O-ring over, which does the actual sealing, it's on that nice smooth place, giving the O-ring the best chance to do its job. For the real assembly, I would coat these with wheel bearing grease and then bag the whole unit up to keep it clean until assembly into the cylinder. Well, I've covered just about everything I could think of about rebuilding these hydraulic ram cylinders. So let's go on with the final assembly of a few of them to show how that goes. Little hydraulic fluid on the threads, putting the bolt back in, and you'll notice this is the more complicated swing cylinder with its springs and washer spacers and that pin sticking out. Now I've already explained and shown how to assemble the swing cylinder in part 3, so we don't need to do that again here. But the final thing they all need is to have this bolt torqued back down tight. So here's our tightening setup. We've got like 8-foot long cheater bars going out in both directions, and that happens to be the boom crowd cylinder rod. And the book says it gets 900 foot-pounds of torque on that bolt. You can see there's the bagged up protected gland, and then the other end we have an old car axle as part of our cheater bar setup.
Contact.
There's another person standing off to the left on the other pipe. Both individuals are 6 feet away from the rod on their pipes, and each person weighs 150 pounds. So doing the math, if I divide 900 pounds by 6 feet, the person only has to push down 150 pounds to come up with the 900 foot-pounds at the bolt head, which is what we're looking for. Well, that was fun. Let's do another. This is one of the swing cylinders, and it's only 700 foot-pounds needed on the bolt, so we are only going out 5 feet on the pole.
5 feet, man on the left. That's better.
There you go.
If you've been following along since part 1, you might can imagine how excited and thrilled I am to have this swing cylinder ready to reassemble after the state it was in when we started. And to bring you up to date, remember back in part 2, I think we were talking about adding these arbor shims on here to build this surface back up on these trunnions. As you can see, they are welded on now. But I later also realized I needed to put another arbor shim down in this ditch on the frame. Now, I didn't get to record any of this on video, but basically what I did was I took an arbor shim and rounded the corners off with this angle sander and just kept fitting it back into that groove in the frame until it had the same slope and it would sit down in there flush. Then I ground 4 little grooves in with an angle grinder and tack welded that arbor shim into the frame, finishing up by grinding the welds down so they were just flat and flush with the rest of the surface.
Here we are assembling one of the cylinders, putting the rod piston assembly into the barrel. We put some grease on the piston and a little hydraulic fluid down in the barrel, and it takes a little bit of persuasion. But we didn't want to pound it in too far because we had it marked and we knew we wanted it to stick out 20 inches. It makes it a lot easier to install back on the tractor if it's the same length it was when we took it off. Now here's the Gland spanner wrench, and that's the 3/4 inch drive breaker bar. Perfect match. But we're not going to torque these down to the 100 to 200 foot-pounds till they're reinstalled on the tractor. It's a lot easier to do it then. I just can't get over what a honey this swing cylinder is turning out to be. Just needs a little more work at the paint shop and it's ready to go. When I think of how it was when we started out, man, it's come a long way. But enough teasing around. Let's see how it looks in the tractor.
Oh my God, I'm in GearHead porn heaven.
All right, you guys, focus. I wanted to show about the arbor shims that are tack welded on the bottom of these trunnion pivots, one on the left, two on the right. And with the one in the frame, it's really tightened up that space and made it more like new. And the trunnion shaft flanges are all installed. 75 foot-pounds torque on all those half-inch bolts. And we can barely make out the little grease fitting in the center. Here's the same upper trunnion pivots, all torqued down, and they're grease fittings. And they are 45-degree angled and turned so that they point out for easy access to grease them. So overall, I am quite pleased with the fit and finish of the installation of these swing cylinders. But there's a problem here. We've got to fix this little flange end of this pivot pin is bent down and it's going to scrape on this rod. So we're going to pull that pin out, bend those end tabs back flat, and then add some shims up above. And that will create more space between that end flange and the rod. Remember this? That's how it was all sloppy and worn out before. Now it only wants to go this way.
Really nice.
Here's another issue that didn't come out quite the way we had planned. This grease fitting, remember we moved it? It used to be there, and it was whacking against the frame there, and that's why we moved it. Well, it turns out that the new position still gets whacked by the frame, so we flipped the rods over, and now the grease fittings are on the inside.
I thought it'd be fun to take a little cruise around the backside of these swing cylinders, see how it all looks from this angle. I'm sure it's noticeable by now that all the areas around where we've been doing work have been repainted with a paint that approximates the original factory color. And we also put new hoses on the swing cylinders.
But getting these hoses disconnected from this valve assembly is a real challenge because they're so close together. And the book shows the use of crowfoot wrenches to get in there. And they really did help get the old hoses off and the new hoses back on again. This swing cylinder wasn't quite out far enough, so we had to pull it out a little bit more. So we hooked the chain to a come-along and to a tree, and we're just come-alonging it out further until it can fit into where it belongs.
Which should be just about there. Keep in mind that all these cylinders we've rebuilt are empty. There's no fluid in them yet. And so we thought we'd take the opportunity to flush and drain the hydraulic tanks on the tractor. We noticed a lot of water contamination. So that process will be coming up ahead here. But first, check out this before and after comparison of the tractor. Yeah, a different season. It's months later. And nice new paint job. Everywhere that something was repaired, changed. Looking good.
Yes, it is. Now we've got to get hydraulic fluid into the tank. That opening is what lets you see if it's full or not. Then up around there is the breather and fill cap. And this is the filter canister. And there's the filter that goes in it. So after installing a new filter and draining the tank, it was time to put some new hydraulic fluid in. If you're going to just put in a little, this is okay, but we put 5-gallon jugs on the roof and let them siphon in because it took 2 5-gallon jugs right off the bat. The tank in this tractor is in the frame, and there's one on each side connected by a common pipe. Down in the corner there is where the drain is, but it's on the other side. You can't see it here. And the other tank has one too. This is a shot of it. There's the drain itself, but you can see there's a place below that doesn't get drained out, and it was full of a watery, gooey sludge. So we first removed that tee from both tanks so we could get direct access into the tank with this suction gun, and sucked out the sludge, and it's this milky part of the oil here, not the little black specks. That wasn't in the oil originally. But what we did was we poured a couple of cups down through the system and then would suck it out, and we just kept repeating that until the oil finally came out of that bottom sump clean and clear. And that includes the bottom sump on the other side. It's an identical tank, just like the one we've been showing here. We took that breather cap off and got a tiny funnel that went into that hole and kept putting cups in there too until that side came out clean and clear too. Then finally we put the drain plugs back in and filled the system up with new fluid. The thing to keep in mind here is that all the cylinders except 2 are empty, so when you turn a control to have something happen, it's not going to happen right away until the cylinder fills up. So he moved the control when he said contact, and we're still waiting. The cylinders finally filled up with hydraulic fluid and started to move. If he raised the engine RPM up to operating speed, it would happen a little quicker, but we're proceeding with caution, watching the newly rebuilt cylinders perform for the first time, and making sure everything's connected correctly.
Speaking of which, we haven't tightened up these glands to their final torque value and put the set screw in yet. This set screw comes in the rebuild kits. The book recommends using a number 26 drill bit, but I found sometimes that hole is too big and the screw doesn't get a good bite, so I was saying maybe use a 28, which is a little bit smaller drill. Okay, here's an often overlooked item when reinstalling the cylinders. This gap between the rod end and its attachment is only supposed to be about a 1/16 of an inch, and that one's okay, but we found on some of them the gap was huge and we had to add quite a few spacer washers to get the gap back down to a 1/16 of an inch.
So now continuing on with cycling all these newly rebuilt cylinders through their range back and forth to purge the air out and make sure everything's working correctly. And as each new set of cylinders fills up with hydraulic fluid, it keeps draining the supply tank, and so we have to keep stopping and adding more in.
Not good for the hydraulic pump to run dry. It drank approximately 16 gallons by the time we got done.
Now out on this backhoe boom, there was only one cylinder that we rebuilt. Not that one, that one. And it's pretty big. It took a lot of fluid to fill it up. Okay, next is the swing cylinders. And you notice the tractor's leaning a little bit to the left there? Well, we didn't realize that once we started to move this over that way, there's no fluid in the cylinder yet on the back side of it. Once it got started going downhill, it just took off on its own out of control until it smashed into the backstop. Luckily, there was no serious damage to anything except maybe a little to our pride. So the backhoe swing did manage to get one more out-of-control wild swing. But now we regrouped, made the tractor more level with the stabilizers, and got the cylinders filled up with fluid, and it's behaving correctly. But the driver there, he's being real cautious, and so he's just moving it little bits at a time and making sure that he's got control of it and it's not going to swing unless he wants it to. Seems to be working fine. Remember a little ways back I was talking about adding in some shims to this backhoe boom swing pivots, and there they are. We took the pins out and added them in, and then this end flange, we bent those tabs flat. So now there's better clearance between that pin flange and the cylinder rod. Good 3/8 of an inch as that swings under there. Good. He's happily reporting that the swing is coming to a cushioned gradual stop automatically at the end of its travel.
This is the heart of the whole project, was that this swinging back and forth was out of control, and now it seems to be working really nice. Look at that. Stops on a dime. Well, a big dime. Probably as close to good as new as we could get it on our budget. Good job, guys.
Thought I'd show off the dash. We rebuilt that with all new gauges and wiring about 5 years ago.
Spiffy looking. Well, I think this rig's ready to go to the dance. And of course, the old guy had to show up and see for himself that the swing was strong again. Oh, Jesus.